China, the Middle Kingdom, had been one of the mightiest powers in the world for centuries. Their hegemony led to its isolation from most geopolitical developments and world politics. After all, China lacked no products within its borders, according to the Qianlong Emperor. When the British Empire demanded trading rights, a contemptuous refusal was all that was given. The Chinese would soon be strong-armed into allowing Western powers to trade on their territory, however. And all this happened during two wars that became known as the Opium Wars. The early stages of the 19th century had been tumultuous for China. The White Lotus Rebellion waged over provinces in central China. As for its international relations, they consisted of tributary states that assumed a subordinate role to the empire. When the British Macartney expedition reached China, Macartney himself was rather surprised the Chinese emperor refused all their requests, such as trade and exchanging diplomatic contacts. Aside from this different take on international relations, the industrialized West far superseded China in terms of industrial and military power. There was an enormous discrepancy in power relations of which China was not yet aware. It was during this time the British started shipping opium from British-controlled India into China. Unable to directly trade with China, Western powers were forced into a separate trading area, the 13 factories, outside of Canton, and had to rely on Chinese middlemen that charged high taxes. Thing is, tea, porcelain, and silk were goods sold with an enormous profit in Europe. As such, trade continued, though the situation was far from ideal. Now, opium was traded for China's silver currency, leading to the outflow and drain of silver from the country. It had a rather negative effect on China's currency system, resulting in hardship on all levels of the population. While opium trade and usage was banned several times, the Brits simply started smuggling opium into the country. There was a movement in China that voiced their support for the legalization of opium. If legalized, the Qing could levy tariffs and taxes on it, they reasoned. This movement was opposed by the Beijing court, however. When in 1934 British Lord Napier arrived in Canton as the first superintendent of trade, one of many misunderstandings arose. He refused to trade via Chinese middlemen, instead demanding relations with the Chinese Governor-General. Chinese officials were forbidden from holding relations with foreigners, however. Traditional system and all. When refused, Napier forced his fleet up to Canton. He passed away of malaria before fighting seriously escalated, but his death postponed war by only a few years. Cooperation between the governments remained impossible, as suppressing opium trade and smuggling didn't work out. The Qing instated more rigorous measures such as the death penalty for both users and smugglers. All the while tensions kept rising. The conditions under which the Qing allowed Western trade in Canton slowly became more problematic for Britain. But for China too, the situation remained extremely negative. Silver flowed out of the country at an incredible pace. In 1839, the Qing government sent the imperial envoy Lin Zexu to Canton. He was authorized by the Qianlong Emperor to put a halt to opium trade. Known for being incorruptible and efficient, he seemed like the perfect man for the job. He even sent a letter to Queen Victoria in which he wrote, "Suppose there were people from another country who carried opium for sale to England and seduced your people into buying and smoking it. Certainly you would deeply hate it and be bitterly aroused." I feel that this letter properly describes the opium trade in China. Lin wanted to root out the opium importers and distributors in Canton. He proved very able to do so. Initially not willing to use force, much less to provoke war, British merchants resisted and Lin saw it necessary to isolate them in their 13 factories. They were forced to rescind their opium stock, which Lin publicly destroyed. Lin certainly was efficient. He secured over 20,000 chests of opium, but his treatment of British citizens was seen as a crime against the London government and Her Majesty Queen Victoria. The Chinese did not fully realize how their course of action would be perceived. British merchants demanded compensation. The British government pointed to the Qing as those that had to pay up. Lord Palmerston, the British Minister of Foreign Affairs, was initially unsympathetic to British merchants not abiding to Chinese law. He changed his opinion in 1839 and now started advocating for British trading rights. Tensions worsened further when a drunken English sailor killed a Chinese citizen in Canton. The British refused to have him tried under Chinese law. The case was symbolic for the two different perceptions of international relations. All the while, Lin continued the cleanse of the Guangdong province. Addicts and dealers were arrested, and the price of opium skyrocketed. When news of opium seizure reached England, Parliament voted to take retaliatory action. Wealthy opium merchants such as William Jarden even returned to England to advocate their cause. Though Parliament was angry, war was not officially declared. British warships under Admiral George Elliot's command from the Indian Squadron appeared in China's Pearl River in June 1840. By then, there had already been skirmishes between Brits and Chinese at Hong Kong. Local population in Canton and Hong Kong poisoned wells and refused to sell food to the British troops. Chinese soldiers, braves, and junks were mobilized. Instead of attacking Chinese fortifications, Elliot's fleet simply blocked the harbor and sailed their force north, blocking other harbors along the way. Sailing along the coast, the British eventually reached the Dagu forts, where serious negotiations with Qianlong, Governor-General of the region, were undertaken. While Qianlong was initially praised by the emperor for his negotiation tactics, within half a year he would be sentenced to death. As it became clear, the British didn't adhere to Chinese demands. On the British side, PM Lord Palmerston was equally furious with Elliot, replacing him with Sir Henry Pottinger. All the while, fighting on the Chinese coast and countryside continued. Often led by Chinese gentry, militants attacked the Brits. These would retaliate by virtually annihilating garrisons, fortresses, junks, and occupying parts of Canton. With less than 7,000 armed troops, the British managed to beat the Qing both on sea and land. It was their technological and naval superiority that made the Qing barely a match for them. The Qing's military backwardness became evident on land, as the bannermen that fought the British troops were often scrambled together groups of undisciplined soldiers. In August 1841, Pottinger sailed north once again and seized multiple ports. He decided to force the Qing to capitulate by cutting off China's main river and seizing Shanghai and Zhenjiang. Local officials were afraid to report the extreme defeats, and as such, the emperor received fabricated reports of victories over the bridge. But when the expeditionary force conquered Chushan Island south of Shanghai, it became clear that Lin had failed his task. He was dismissed in disgrace. It wasn't difficult for the Brits to amass victory over victory. The amount of casualties by the end of the war shows this all too clear. There were under 1,000 British casualties, while the Chinese suffered around 20,000. They now started to wonder how to capitalize on their overwhelming military power. After all, they weren't eager to gain more territory in China. They simply wanted to be able to use the country as their foreign market. Open it up, so to speak. Eventually, British forces started to close in on Nanjing, China's second largest city. Pottinger refused to negotiate with the Qing until they agreed to a complete deal. Eventually, the Qing gave in. They had to give in if it wanted to continue its rule over the Chinese people, retain some form of domestic stability, and maintain its mandate of heaven. When the Treaty of Nanjing was signed by Qi, all demands by the British were met. Ironically, the reason this war started, opium, was not mentioned at all. To begin with, the Qing conceded Hong Kong, which would become a British stronghold in China. Furthermore, Canton, Shanghai, Amoy, Fuzhou, and Ningpo were the first treaty ports open to foreign trade. China was only allowed to raise extremely low tariffs, which could not be altered. British merchants were not subjected to Chinese law, but to British law, as long as they traded within the treaty port. Britain was acknowledged as a diplomatic equal, and lastly, the most favored nations clause was implemented. This meant all privileges other powers enjoyed in China, the Brits now automatically would enjoy as well. An indemnity to pay for confiscated opium and war reparation had to be paid. Other Western powers now hurried to the table to force similar treaties upon the Qing. In short, an entire system of treaties was signed, referred to as unequal treaties in Chinese historiography. The British Supplementary Treaty, American Treaty, and French Treaty followed in the years after the Nanjing Treaty. These treaties and Western powers gaining a foothold in China, undermining the traditional power, eventually led to a second set of wars and treaties in the late 1850s. Shortly after the Peace of Nanjing, tensions again arose. After all, the Qing accepted the peace terms with much reluctance. The Treaty of Nanjing was considered a temporary setback, and the most favored nation clause was considered a way to pit the Western powers against each other. Opium trade expanded along the Chinese coast. During the 1850s, opium import rose to between 50 and 60,000 chests a year, double that of the 1830s. Opium addiction increased and silver kept flowing out of the country. In 1851, the anti-Western Qianlong Emperor ascended to the throne. He was faced with the deadliest civil war the world had ever seen, the Taiping Rebellion, and concurrent Nean and Muslim rebellions. Now, although the rebellion spread, foreign trade in tea, silk, and opium increased. When the provisions of the Nanjing Treaty came up for debate in 1854, the emperor refused to concede any more treaty ports, nor should Westerners be allowed to move freely within China. Allowing foreign diplomats in Beijing was completely out of the question. In treaty ports themselves, Westerners were continuously subjected to anti-foreign sentiment, unstable tariffs, and corruption. The assassination of a French missionary and the disregarding of a British flag on a Chinese vessel named Arrow provided the pretext to once again wage war against China. And as such, the French too were dragged into the conflict. French and British naval fleets sailed onto Canton, and without too much trouble the port was captured, and a puppet government was installed in the city. In 1858, the Qing quickly sued for peace. Accompanying the British and French delegation were American and Russian plenipotentiaries. These secured near identical treaties for their own countries. One of the treaty terms stated that Qing had to allow foreign diplomats to stay in Beijing. Considering this would uproot the entire traditional system of tributary states, the Qing became hesitant. They decided not to concede this point, although it had been agreed to in drafts. When British and French ministers wanted to enter Beijing, they were refused passage. British warships were sunk out of nowhere, and the delegations were repelled from the capital, for now. In 1860, a year later, the French and British returned with a vengeance. Outmatching the Qing troops under Prince Senge Rinchen in both technology and numbers, the bannermen were quickly defeated. Beijing was captured and the emperor fled to Yehou. British negotiator Lord Elgin was subsequently arrested during negotiations, even though he flew a flag of truce. 20 of his men were executed. As a reprisal, once he was released, Elgin made sure to burn down the emperor's summer palace. Prince Gong, now the main Chinese negotiator, agreed to a treaty encompassing all those demands of 1858. This treaty is considered the official opening of the Chinese Empire to the Western world. Foreign privileges had been increased and trade would soon blossom for the West. These Western powers would play a big role in the next couple of decades of Chinese history, and Prince Gong too played an important role in Chinese politics, most notably as a proponent of the self-strengthening movement. In 1858, the import of opium was legalized, yet ever since 1839 there barely were any obstacles imposed by the Chinese to its import. It was not until the last phase of the Qing in 1906 that laws were implemented to object opium usage and trade. Actual effective combating had been in place since 1949, over a century after the First Opium War. As the French and Brits waged war against China, the Taiping Rebellion, the deadliest civil war the world had ever seen, broke out. These concurrent events were testament to the dire instability the Qing dynasty found itself in during these years. After the Second Opium War, a movement propagating Chinese reform led by Prince Gong was launched. This self-strengthening movement was opposed by hardline conservatives in Chinese politics led by Empress Dowager Cixi. If you want to know what happened in the decades after the Opium Wars up until the eventual downfall of the Qing dynasty and abdication of China's last emperor, click on the playlist on the screen right now. Thank you for watching this video, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.